The sensation was a shock to the system, immediate and electric. Her fingertip didn't just touch my collarbone. It traced the bone's ridge with a terrifying, deliberate slowness that mocked the crowd surrounding us. We stood in the center of the grand ballroom, hemmed in by industry titans and the hum of billion-dollar deals. Yet the noise faded into white static. I froze, my breath catching in a throat suddenly too tight to allow air. This wasn't professional friction anymore. The collision of our rivalry had ignited into a sudden, terrifying intimacy. The game we had played for years had just become a dangerous reality. She leaned in closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain overwhelming the room, and whispered the dare. I exist in a world of load-bearing walls and calculated risks. As a senior architect, my reputation is built on absolute precision. I don't guess, I calculate. I design structures that withstand hurricanes and earthquakes because I respect the math of survival. At the firm, they call me the steel spine, a nickname I wear like armor against the chaos of the creative process. But Violet? Violet is the hurricane I try to design against. She is all organic curves and chaotic genius, the kind of architect who believes a building should breathe rather than just stand. We are the binary stars of this firm, circling the same lead partner promotion for 3 years, our gravity warping everything around us. The setting for tonight's collision was the firm's annual gala, a spectacle of glass, steel, and expensive ambition, held in the atrium of our latest triumph. The ceiling soared 60 feet above us, a transparent membrane separating the elite from the stars. But down here, the atmosphere was suffocating. I adjusted the silk of my dress, feeling exposed in something that wasn't a tailored suit. I preferred blueprints to ball gowns. Blueprints didn't lie. They didn't smile at you while plotting your obsolescence. I stood near a pillar of brushed aluminum, swirling a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, watching the room. I saw the partners, the clients, the sharks in tuxedos. But mostly, I felt the absence of safety. My precision was a shield, but shields get heavy. For years, our rivalry had been a Cold War, fought with accolades and late-night emails. I would stay until midnight perfecting a rendering. She would arrive at 10 the next morning with a vision that rendered my logic obsolete. We played a game, though neither of us named it. It started with subtle jabs in partner meetings, her critiquing my sterility, me questioning her structural integrity. Then it escalated. She would leave coffee on my desk just as I was crashing. I would correct her spec sheets without telling the juniors. It was a dance of dominance, masked as polite disdain. But lately, the music had changed. The challenges felt less about the work and more about us. I was exhausted. The sheer caloric burn of maintaining this facade of unflinching perfection was draining me dry. I stood near the towering glass wall that overlooked the city we were slowly reshaping, feeling the weight of the mask I wore. Violet represented everything I suppressed. Where I saw a grid, she saw a flow. Where I saw risk, she saw opportunity. The partners loved us both, me for the safety, her for the flash. They pitted us against each other like fighting dogs, throwing the lead partner role into the ring like a raw steak. We tore at each other for their amusement. But beneath the professional antagonism, there was a frequency only we could hear, a recognition. We were the only 2 people in the room who understood the cost of this ambition. The game had shifted last month, during the pitch for the Waterfront Museum. I had presented a sleek, flood-resistant fortress. Violet had countered with a floating pavilion that moved with the tides. She won the client's heart. I won the safety inspector's approval. Afterward, in the elevator, she had leaned against the mirrored wall and said, "You're so afraid of getting wet, you forget how to swim." It wasn't an insult. It was an observation that landed like a physical blow. Then I saw her. Violet cut through the crowd like a fissure in concrete. She wore a suit, sharp and midnight blue, that fit her with devastating ease. She wasn't looking at the potential clients or the board members. Her gaze was locked on me, unflinching, amused, dangerous. She held 2 flutes of champagne, her fingers long and elegant around the stems. As she closed the distance, the noise of the gala seemed to dampen, swallowed by the sudden spike in atmospheric pressure. She stopped just inside my personal space, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in her iris, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her skin. She didn't offer a greeting. She just held out a glass, her lips curving into a smile that promised ruin. "You look like you're calculating the tensile strength of the hors d'oeuvres," she said, her voice low and smooth. I accepted the champagne, the crystal flute cold against my fingers, a sharp contrast to the sudden, inexplicable heat climbing the back of my neck. "I'm not calculating," I lied, my voice steady, though it pitched lower than I intended. "I'm observing structural flaws. It's what keeps buildings from collapsing on people like you." Violet laughed, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, bypassing my logic centers entirely. "Always the inspector, never the inhabitant." She took a slow sip of her drink, her gaze dissecting me with surgical precision. "You know your problem? You think if you stop analyzing the load path for 1 second, the whole world comes down." I straightened my spine, relying on the muscle memory of 1,000 boardroom battles. "It usually does." "Not always," she murmured. She took a step closer, invading the polite distance dictated by corporate etiquette. The air between us thickened, charged with a static that wasn't professional rivalry. It was heavier, denser. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the sway is what keeps it standing. You have to feel the wind, not just measure it." "I don't rely on feelings, Violet. I rely on cold physics." "Then let's test the physics." Her eyes dropped to my throat, then snapped back to mine, dark and challenging. "Truth or dare is too juvenile for the executive track," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt louder than the jazz band. "But a stress test? That's right up your alley." She set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray without breaking eye contact. "I dare you." "Dare me to what?" I mocked, though my pulse was already betraying me, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "To stand there. To maintain that famous, untouchable composure. To not retreat into your blueprints while I prove a point." "And what point is that?" "That you're not made of steel." She stepped fully into my personal space. In the architectural world, we talk about compression and tension. This was pure, unadulterated tension. She defied the heavy social gravity of the room, ignoring the board members watching from the periphery, ignoring the decorum that governed our careers. She was close enough that I could count the individual lashes framing her eyes, close enough to feel the radiant heat of her body through the silk of my dress. She raised her hand. The movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. Her knuckle grazed the hollow of my throat. The sensation was shocking, a physical intrusion into my carefully calibrated world. The cool metal of her signet ring brushed my skin, followed immediately by the warmth of her fingertip. This was the moment, the trace. She slid her finger along my collarbone. It wasn't a caress, it was an interrogation. She was tracing the line of me like I was a draft she was correcting, seeking out the hairline fractures in my resolve. The scent of sandalwood and rain, her distinct scent, filled my lungs, drowning out the expensive perfume and stale ambition of the gala. My breath hitched, a traitorous sound I couldn't suppress. I commanded my body to remain absolutely still, to be the statue she accused me of being. But my blood was rioting. The contact sent a jolt straight down my spine, shattering the steel spine myth in a heartbeat. I wasn't thinking about load-bearing walls. I was thinking about how soft her skin was, how calloused her fingertips were from sketching. I was thinking about how terrifyingly easy it would be to lean into her. The hum of the industry titans, the clinking of crystal, the polite laughter, it all receded into a dull, meaningless roar. There was only the pressure of her finger and the challenge in her eyes. I felt exposed, stripped of my professional armor. This wasn't a game anymore. It was a demolition. She was daring me to feel, and I was failing the test because I felt everything. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, the sudden, sharp ache of desire that had nothing to do with a promotion and everything to do with the woman dismantling me with a single touch. She saw it. She saw the crack in the facade. Her eyes darkened, a flicker of satisfaction mixed with something hotter, something unguarded. She held the contact for 1 second longer, an eternity in the silence between us, then pulled her hand away. The loss of contact was physically painful. "You failed," she whispered, her voice rough. She stepped back, the mask sliding back into place, leaving me breathless, the ghost of her touch burning on my skin. Morning light in a glass-walled office is an interrogation tool. It reveals every fatigue line and every hesitation in a line wait. I sat at my desk, needing the certainty of a ruler. I reviewed load calculations, forcing my brain to process vectors, trying to drown out the sensory memory. But the numbers kept rearranging themselves into the curve of a smile. The spot on my collarbone where she touched me throbbed, a separate heartbeat out of sync. I had spent the night replaying that 10 seconds of contact on a loop. I told myself it was just adrenaline. Violet was a master of disruption. I walked into conference room B at 8 sharp. The room was a fishbowl, walls of floor-to-ceiling glass offering transparency but no privacy. I laid my tablet on the mahogany table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. Precision. Control. I was the steel spine. I didn't crumble because of a finger on a clavicle. Then the door opened. Violet walked in. She wore gray today, a soft wool that looked deceptively cozy until you saw the sharp cut of the lapels. She carried a coffee cup and a roll of drawings, movements loose and easy. She didn't look like a woman who had crossed a professional demilitarized zone 12 hours ago. "Morning," she said, sliding into the chair directly across from me. Not the one at the far end, the one right there. The scent of her, sandalwood and rain, drifted across the table, invading my sterile airspace. It was a sensory ambush. "You look tense," she observed, her eyes clear but the corner of her mouth twitching. "Did the hors d'oeuvres disagree with you?" "I'm focused," I corrected, not looking up. "There's a difference." Marcus, the senior partner, breezed in, oblivious to the high-voltage current arcing across the table. "The Skyline Initiative," he announced, projecting a rendering onto the smart glass wall. "The board approved the concept, a high-altitude luxury retreat that defies gravity, cantilevered over the ridge, glass floors, exposure." He looked at us. "It needs to be iconic. It needs the structural impossibility that you," he pointed at me, "can make stand up, and the aesthetic insanity that you," he pointed at Violet, "can dream up." We were forced to look at the screen, at the jagged line of the mountain where the structure would hang. It was a beautiful, terrifying project. A house made of air and risk. "We need a unified vision," Marcus continued. "No more infighting. The structural challenges are significant. Unstable bedrock, high wind loads. We need a site assessment immediately, before the snows set in." I felt the trap snap shut before he even said the words. "I want you both up there," Marcus said. "Take the company car, drive up to the site, stay at the guest cabin, spend 2 days walking the land. Don't come back until you agree on a foundation strategy." Violet looked at me. I looked at Violet. The silence stretched, elastic and thin. 2 days? Violet asked, her voice neutral, but her eyes locking onto mine. 2 days, Marcus confirmed, checking his watch. "Leave by noon. It's a 4-hour drive. And try not to push each other off the cliff, all right? The insurance premiums are high enough." He laughed at his own joke and gathered his files. "Good luck." The door clicked shut behind him. The silence rushed back in, deafening this time. We were alone in the glass box. I stared at the rendering of the house hanging over the abyss, a structure that demanded we trust the invisible forces holding it together. 2 days. Isolated, in a cabin, with the woman who had traced my skin and called me a coward. Violet capped her pen with a decisive click. "Well," she said, her voice dropping to that low, smoky register that vibrated in my chest. "Looks like you're stuck with me." I finally looked at her. She wasn't gloating. She was watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch again. There was no escape. The blueprints couldn't save me now. "I'll drive," I said, standing up abruptly, needing to move. "I know," she replied softly. "You always do." The air between us was so thick you could have struck a match on it, igniting everything we had carefully built. I grabbed my tablet and walked out, feeling her eyes on my back, tracing my spine just as deliberately as her finger had traced my collarbone. The glass walls of the office suddenly felt less like a transparent shield and more like a cage, and the door had just been locked. The company SUV was a German-engineered capsule designed to eliminate road noise. For 4 hours, we were sealed in a leather and chrome vacuum, climbing higher into the Cascades, leaving the safety of the city grid far behind. I drove with my usual white-knuckled discipline, keeping the speedometer exactly at the limit. Violet sat in the passenger seat, not looking at her phone, not looking at the blueprints, but looking at the profile of my face. I could feel her gaze, like a physical weight on my cheekbone, a heat lamp I couldn't switch off. "You grip the wheel like you're trying to strangle it," she murmured around mile marker 40. "I'm maintaining control," I said, eyes on the asphalt. "The roads are icing over." "Control," she repeated, tasting the word like a tart wine. "You think if you let go for a second, we'll slide off the edge?" Physics suggests we might. We arrived at the site. The Skyline Initiative was currently nothing but a skeleton, a grid of red steel I-beams jutting out over a 2,000-foot drop, waiting for us to give it skin. It was violent and beautiful, a scar on the mountain that we were tasked with turning into a sanctuary. The wind up here was ferocious, stripping away the warmth of the car instantly. We put on hard hats and navigated the mud, stepping over rebar and conduit. I went immediately to the primary cantilever, the structural heart of the project. I needed to touch the steel, to verify the anchor points. Violet followed, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't look at the anchors. She walked to the very edge of the unrailed beam, standing inches from the abyss, her coat whipping around her legs. "It needs to be glass here," she shouted over the wind, pointing down at the void. "The floor. Total transparency. When they step out, they need to feel the drop." "Glass has a lower yield point than steel," I argued, moving closer to pull her back from the edge, instinct overriding protocol, though I stopped 3 feet away. "You're introducing necessary fragility." She turned to face me, the wind blowing her dark hair across her face. "That's the point. Vulnerability is the luxury. Safety is cheap. Anyone can build a bunker. I want to build a breathless moment." You confuse breathless with reckless, and you confuse structural integrity with emotional repression. She stepped off the beam onto the muddy bank, closing the distance between us. The raw steel loomed above us, a cage not yet closed. "We talk about compression and tension in every meeting, but you only understand compression. You understand the weight pressing down. You don't understand tension, the force that pulls things apart until they sing. Tension snaps things, Violet, only if they're too rigid to flex." Her eyes dropped to my mouth, then back up. The professional mask I wore was slipping, eroded by the wind and her proximity. Here, on the side of a mountain, the boardroom politics felt insignificant. There were no partners to impress, just the physics of us. She reached out, her hand hovering near my arm, not touching, but close enough that the air charged between us again. "What is the yield point of this?" she asked quietly, gesturing between us. "The point where the material deforms and never goes back to its original shape?" I looked at her, really looked at her. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, her eyes bright with the same obsession that kept me awake at night. We were rivals, yes, but standing under the skeleton of this impossible house, I realized we were the only two people who cared enough to bleed for it. "We're past the elastic limit," I admitted, my voice lost to the wind. She smiled, sharp and knowing. "Good." We stood there for a moment longer, united by the terrifying beauty of the structure and the terrifying reality of the silence between us. Then the snow started, fat, heavy flakes that signaled the pass was closing. "The cabin," I said, turning away before I did something reckless, like agree with her. "We need to get inside." "Lead the way, Steel Spine," she teased, but her voice was softer now. We walked toward the finished guest cabin, nestled in the trees, the only warm light for miles, leaving the cold steel behind for a different kind of heat. The guest cabin was a masterclass in forced intimacy. It was a compact structure of cedar and glass, designed to disappear into the tree line. But tonight, with the storm sealing us in, it felt less like a retreat and more like a pressure vessel. The heating system hummed a low, steady note, battling the drop in temperature outside, while the fire I had built in the iron stove crackled with aggressive enthusiasm. We moved around the kitchenette in a silence that was louder than the wind. I was chopping vegetables for a makeshift pasta dish, my knife striking the cutting board with rhythmic, military precision. Chop, slide. Chop, slide. It was a way to organize the chaos in my head. If I could control the size of the peppers, I could control the fact that Violet was standing 3 feet away, uncorking a bottle of Cabernet with a languid grace that made my breath catch. "You chop like you're drafting," she observed, leaning against the counter, glass in hand. "Perfect, uniform cubes. It's terrifying." "Uniformity ensures even cooking," I replied, not looking up. "It's efficient." "It's predictable." She slid a glass of wine toward me across the granite island. Her fingers brushed the stem. My fingers brushed the stem. The transfer of heat was instantaneous. "Predictable is boring, darling. Sometimes you have to let the ingredients dictate the shape. That's how you get uneven heat distribution. That's how things burn, or how they caramelize." We cooked together, a dance of avoidance and intersection. It felt dangerous. Domesticity implies a truce, a shared rhythm of life that we had no right to possess. We were rivals who tore each other apart in boardrooms, yet here we were, navigating a 5x5 kitchen without colliding. I reached for the salt. She handed it to me before I asked. She moved to the sink. I stepped back to give her room, anticipating her trajectory. It was a seamless, terrifying choreography. It suggested that our friction wasn't just interference. It was a form of fit. We ate at the small round table near the hearth. The firelight threw long, dancing shadows against the wood paneling, softening the sharp angles of Violet's face. The wine was heavy and oaky, sitting warm in my stomach, slowly dissolving the rigid knots in my shoulders. "Why do you do it?" Violet asked suddenly. She wasn't looking at her plate. She was watching me over the rim of her glass, her gaze stripping away the layers of my professional persona. "Do what?" "Hide behind the math. The steel spine. You wear that nickname like a medal, but I see it for what it is. It's a corset. You've laced yourself so tight, you can barely breathe." I set my fork down, the metal clinking sharply against the ceramic. "Structure is safety, Violet. In our line of work, people die when the math is wrong. I don't hide. I ensure survival. I build things that last." "You build things that resist," she corrected softly. "There's a difference. You think if you calculate every load path, you can prevent the collapse, but you're applying that logic to yourself. You think if you never lose control, you'll never be hurt. And you think if you throw caution to the wind, you're living. But usually, you just end up cold." "Maybe." She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving mine. "But at least I feel the wind." The conversation hung in the air, heavy with subtext. The fire popped, a sudden spark against the grate. "That's why I did it," she said. "I didn't have to ask." The dare. "It wasn't a whim," she admitted, swirling the dark liquid in her glass. "It was a hypothesis. I've watched you for 3 years. Perfect posture, perfect designs, perfect defenses. I wanted to know if it was solid, all the way through." "You wanted to find a structural flaw." "No," she shook her head, a small secret smile playing on her lips. "I wanted to see if there was a pulse under the armor. I wanted to see if I could make the steel spine shiver. You were testing me. I was daring you to be human." She leaned forward, the table suddenly feeling very small. "And for the record, your heart rate spiked. I saw it in your neck." I felt the flush rise, betraying me again. "I was surprised. You invaded my personal space. I entered your orbit, and you didn't push me away." We finished the wine in silence, but the air had changed. The intellectual sparring was dissolving into something rawer. We moved to the sofa, a low velvet thing facing the fire. I sat on one end, hugging a throw pillow like a shield. She sat on the other, legs tucked under her, relaxed, fluid. The bottle was empty. The distance between us on the cushions was perhaps 2 feet, but in the dim light, with the storm howling outside and the fire crackling inside, that distance felt negligible. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled. She turned her body toward me, her arm resting along the back of the sofa, her fingers inches from my shoulder. The professional rivalry was gone, left out in the cold with the steel beams. In here, there was only the heat, the wine, and the terrifying realization that the structure I had built to keep her out was actually a trap I had built to keep myself in. The blizzard outside wasn't just a weather event. It was a containment field. The snow drove horizontally, a relentless white curtain slamming against the glass with a violence that made the heavy cedar timbers of the cabin groan. We were sealed in. The road back to the city was gone, buried under inches of ice and powder. The steel skeleton of the Skyline Initiative was invisible now, swallowed by the void. There was no escape route, no emergency exit, no taxi to hail. We were trapped in a capsule of firelight and silence, suspended 2,000 feet in the air. Violet stood and walked to the massive floor-to-ceiling window that served as the cabin's primary focal point. The glass was freezing, radiating a chill that battled the stove's aggressive heat. I followed her. I told myself I was checking the conditions, assessing the wind load on the glazing. I lied. I followed because her gravity was stronger than my discipline. We stood side by side, staring out into the churning white darkness. The reflection in the glass was ghostly, superimposed over the storm. It showed two women standing close, too close for colleagues, too close for rivals. In the glass, we looked like a unit, a singular entity standing against the chaos. The reflection stripped away the context of the office. It didn't show the titles or the competition. It just showed the proximity. "Look at us," Violet whispered. Her breath fogged the glass, a fleeting cloud on the cold surface. In the reflection, we don't look like we're at war. Reflections are distortions, I countered, but my voice lacked its usual steel. It was soft, frayed at the edges. They flatten depth. They hide the cracks. Or maybe they reveal the alignment. She turned her head, not to look at me, but to watch my reflection watching hers. We spend so much time fighting for the same territory, we forget we're the only two people who can breathe at this altitude. The atmosphere shifted. The intellectual sparring that had defined our dinner, the safe, sharp banter about architecture and philosophy, dissolved. In its place was something raw, sensory, and terrifyingly heavy. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering, spicy sandalwood perfume she wore. It filled my lungs, drowning out the logic I clung to. "Are you still pretending?" she asked. She didn't look at me directly yet. She kept her eyes on our ghostly twins in the glass. "Pretending what?" "That you didn't feel it. At the gala. The trace." She turned then, putting her back to the storm, blocking out the whiteout so all I could see was her. "Are you still pretending it was just a game?" My internal world was fracturing. The CEO brain, the part of me that managed risk, calculated profit margins, and drafted airtight contracts, was screaming to retreat. Move away. Cite the late hour. Go to the bedroom. Lock the door. It was the voice of self-preservation, the voice that had gotten me to the senior executive track. But the lover heart, God, how I hated that term, but it was the only variable that fit, was beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. It was drowning out the logic. It was a structural failure in real time. I felt it, I admitted, the words tasting like dangerous truth. It was a disruption. "A disruption," she repeated, tasting the word. "Like an earthquake is a disruption. But the fault lines were there for centuries, weren't they?" She stepped closer. The distance was now measured in inches. The tension coiled tight, a physical thing winding between us, compressing the air until it was hard to breathe. It was like a high-stakes negotiation where the only currency left on the table was vulnerability. We had run out of blueprints. We had run out of safe topics. There was only the silence and the heat radiating from her skin. "You want to know why I challenge you?" she asked, her voice dropping to that low, smoky register that vibrated in my chest. "Because you're the only structure I can't figure out how to bring down. You're a vault, and I want to know what's inside. I'm not a demolition project, Violet. No. You're a mystery masked as a monument." The wind howled, rattling the pane behind her, a violent counterpoint to the stillness between us. She didn't flinch. Her focus was absolute. "You said structure is safety," she murmured. Her hand lifted. My breath stalled in my throat. It was the same motion as the gala, but slower, deliberate. There was no audience this time, no dare, just intent. "But safety is just a cage you build for yourself." Her hand hovered near my neck, the warmth of her palm palpable before she even made contact. The anticipation was worse than the touch. It was a suspended cord waiting for resolution. I could have stepped back. I could have walked away. But I stayed rooted to the spot, paralyzed not by fear, but by a desperate, terrifying need to see if the building would stand or fall. Her fingertip landed. It wasn't the light, teasing brush from the ballroom. This was heavy, grounded, possessing the weight of a claim. She traced the ridge of my collarbone, her skin rough against my pulse, And the sensation didn't just ripple through me, it shattered the foundation. There was no audience this time, no board of directors, no clinking champagne flutes, no dare to hide behind. There was just the storm, the fire, and the terrifying realization that the only thing keeping me upright was the tension I had spent 3 years denying. I stopped thinking. The blueprints in my head, the load calculations, the risk assessments, they all dissolved into white noise. My precision was useless here. You can't calculate the trajectory of a landslide when you're already falling. I didn't step back. I didn't deflect with a witty professional barb. I stepped in. I surrendered to the gravity that had been pulling at us since the day we met. I caught her wrist, intending to stop her, but my hand betrayed me. Instead of pushing her away, my fingers curled around her forearm, pulling her closer. The steel spine snapped. The first kiss wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a movie scene. It was a merger. It was the necessary, violent alignment of two forces that had been grinding against each other for years. Violet didn't hesitate. She made a sound, a low, wrecked noise in her throat, and crushed her mouth against mine. It tasted of the oaky wine and the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline. It wasn't tentative. It was an answer to a question neither of us had been brave enough to ask out loud. I felt the shock of it in my knees. Her hands were everywhere, tangling in my hair, gripping my waist, mapping the architecture of my body with a frantic, starving urgency. I forgot about the storm outside. I forgot about the Skyline Initiative. The only structure that mattered was the line of her throat as she tilted her head back, the solid reality of her body pressed against mine. Finally, she breathed against my lips, the word vibrating through me. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I was too busy learning the texture of her. For years, Violet had been an abstract concept, a rival, a headache, a variable. Now she was heat and muscle and breath. I ran my hands down the sharp tailoring of her blazer, finding the hem, finding the skin beneath. It was soft, shockingly warm, a contrast to the icy intellect she projected in the boardroom. This was the vulnerability she had preached about on the cliff edge. It wasn't weakness. It was this terrifying openness, this sensation of being unroofed, exposed to the elements. And God, it was addictive. I realized, with a jolt of clarity that pierced the haze of desire, that I hadn't been fighting her because I hated her style. I had been fighting her because I knew, on a cellular level, that she was the only one who could dismantle me. We moved blindly, stumbling back until the edge of the sofa caught my legs. We collapsed onto it, a tangle of limbs and lost composure. The firelight painted us in gold and shadow, flickering over us as we tore down the walls we'd built. There was no gentle exploration here. We knew each other too well for that. We knew each other's minds, and now our bodies were catching up, speaking a language of friction and release. Every touch was a reclamation. Every kiss was a sealed contract. I buried my face in the curve of her neck, inhaling the sandalwood and rain, and felt something inside me settle. It was the feeling of a keystone dropping into an arch, the sudden, perfect distribution of weight. I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. The rivalry, the ambition, the exhaustion, it was all shared now, metabolized into this frantic, necessary heat. The storm raged on, burying the world in white, but inside, the chaos had finally found its center. We fell asleep like that, entangled, the boundaries between rival and lover obliterated, leaving only the quiet, heavy truth of the morning waiting for us. Morning light acts like a relentless auditor. It demands you account for the chaos of the night before. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside the cabin encased in a blinding, silent white. Inside, the fire was dead ash, and the temperature had dropped enough to see your breath. I woke up to this clinical brightness, the sun reflecting off the snow with an intensity that bleached out the shadows where we had hidden. For a moment, just a heartbeat, I felt a heavy, languid peace. The residual warmth of Violet's arm thrown over my waist, the solid reality of her body heat acting as a furnace against the chill. Then the steel spine rebooted. The peace evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp injection of adrenaline that tasted like panic. I lay frozen, staring at the cedar beams of the ceiling, while my brain ran a catastrophic simulation of the future. We had just slept with the competition. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a demolition of the professional boundaries I had spent a decade surveying. We were vying for the same lead partner role. We were currently on a company-sanctioned trip. HR would view this as a liability. The board would view it as a loss of focus. I had let the vulnerability in, and now I was terrified it would structurally compromise the career I had built to protect myself. I was already drafting the resignation letter in my head, calculating the severance package, wondering if I could move to a firm in Chicago before the rumors started. "Stop it," a voice rasped next to my ear. I turned my head. Violet was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching me with that same unflinching, heavy-lidded gaze she used when inspecting a site foundation. She didn't look regretful. She looked satisfied. Her hair was a chaotic halo, her eyes dark with sleep but sharp with recognition. She wasn't hiding from the morning light. She was basking in it. "Stop what?" I whispered, my voice tight. "Stop calculating the blast radius," she said, reaching out to trace the line of my jaw, her thumb brushing over the pulse that was undoubtedly hammering. "I can hear your gears grinding from here. You're wondering how to retrofit this into your 5-year plan. You're wondering if you need to build a firewall." "We crossed a line, Violet. A load-bearing line." "We erased a line," she corrected. "There's a difference." I pulled away, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to think without the distraction of her skin against mine. I wrapped the duvet around myself, a temporary shield, and walked to the kitchen to start the coffee. The domestic ritual felt surreal. I was making coffee for my rival in a cabin isolated by snow, wearing nothing but a sheet and existential dread. But as the scent of dark roast filled the air, replacing the scent of sex and wood smoke, the panic began to settle into something more pragmatic. Violet joined me a moment later, wearing one of my spare dress shirts. It was too big for her, the cuffs rolled up, and seeing her in my structured clothing did something to my chest that I hadn't anticipated. It didn't look like a conquest. It looked like an integration. She leaned against the counter, accepting the mug I offered. "So," I said, leaning back against the sink, gripping the ceramic for warmth, "what is this? A strategic merger? A hostile takeover?" "It's a collaboration," she said, blowing on the steam. "The Skyline Initiative. We were trying to design it separately. You wanted a bunker, I wanted a cloud. We were both wrong. And you think this," I gestured between us, "fixes the design flaws?" "I think the friction was never about the architecture," she admitted, her eyes locking onto mine over the rim of the mug. "We've been fighting for 3 years because it was the only way we knew how to touch each other without breaking the rules. The rivalry was just foreplay, darling. We were burning off energy because we were too scared to harness it." I looked at her, really looked at her, and the truth of it settled into my bones. The exhaustion I had felt for months wasn't from the work. It was from the resistance. We weren't opposites canceling each other out. We were a tension system. Compression and suspension. "I don't know how to do this without a blueprint," I confessed, dropping the last of my defenses. "Then we draw a new one," she said, stepping into my space, the coffee forgotten. "We draft it as we go, as-built. No more hiding behind the structure." The drive back to the city was a study in altered physics. The road had been cleared, the black asphalt cutting through the white landscape. I drove, but my grip on the wheel was loose, relaxed. The silence in the car wasn't the heavy, charged vacuum of the trip up. It was comfortable, breathable. Violet sat with her boots on the dash, sketching furiously on her tablet, occasionally showing me a line or a curve. We weren't two rivals returning to the arena. We were a unified front, returning to the war room. The fear was still there, a low hum in the background, but the isolation was gone. I checked the rearview mirror, not to look at where we had been, but to catch her eye. She winked. And for the first time in my career, I didn't care about the destination. I just wanted to keep driving. The boardroom at the pinnacle of the firm is designed to intimidate. It is a theater of war, paneled in dark walnut and silence, where the air conditioning is always set to a temperature that encourages alertness and discourages comfort. Usually, I enter this room with my armor on tight, ready to defend every bolt and beam of my designs against partners who view creativity as a line item to be minimized. Today, however, the air felt different. I wasn't standing at the head of the table alone. Violet stood beside me, not as a competitor waiting for me to stumble, but as a counterbalance. The Skyline Initiative projected on the smart glass behind us, a structure that shouldn't work, a marriage of heavy anchoring and terrifying exposure. Marcus leaned back, tapping his gold pen against the mahogany. "It's aggressive," he said, the corporate code word for risky. "You're asking us to suspend a multi-million-dollar asset over a fault line. You're asking for trust in geology that is historically unstable." 6 months ago, I would have pulled up a spreadsheet proving the safety factors. I would have buried him in data until he suffocated. Today, I looked at Violet. She stepped forward, seamless. "We aren't asking you to ignore the fault line," she said, her voice holding that low, resonant confidence that I now knew tasted like coffee and morning. "We're asking you to build into it. The structure doesn't resist the movement. It dampens it. It breathes with the mountain." I picked up the thread without a pause, the handover smoother than any rehearsed speech. "It's a tension system," I explained, pointing to the cantilever on the screen. "The steel spine provides the rigidity, but the glass floor allows for the experience of the fall without the danger. We are selling the thrill of the drop, anchored by absolute security. Its strength through vulnerability." The word hung in the room. Vulnerability. A word I had banned from my professional vocabulary for a decade. Violet caught my eye, a micro-expression of pride flashing before she turned back to the board. We moved through the presentation like a single organism with two heads. Where I laid the foundation of hard math, she built the walls of emotion. I gave them the how, she gave them the why. The partners stopped taking notes. They were watching the chemistry, the undeniable force of two rivals who had stopped crashing into each other and started flowing in the same direction. We were selling them a harmony of opposites, and they were buying every square foot. When we finished, the silence wasn't heavy. It was stunned. We got the approval. We got the budget. But as we packed up our files, the victory wasn't in Marcus's enthusiastic handshake. It was in the secret, almost imperceptible graze of Violet's hand against mine under the table. The elevator ride down was the true exhale. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a steel box that felt infinitely safer than the open office. The professional masks dropped instantly. I slumped against the wall, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the gala. Violet turned to me, her eyes dancing with the adrenaline of the kill. "Strength through vulnerability," she teased, stepping into my space, the magnetic pull between us reasserting itself now that the audience was gone. "You're quoting me now?" "I'm citing sources," I murmured, pulling her in by the lapels of her blazer, my blazer. "It's good scholarship." We didn't kiss, the security cameras were watching, but the proximity was enough. The air between us was electric, charged with the thrill of getting away with something massive. We had just sold them our relationship, disguised as a building. "We're going to be trouble," she whispered, straightening my tie, her knuckles brushing my collarbone, a deliberate, ghosting echo of the dare that started it all. "We're going to be legends," I corrected. The elevator bell chimed. The doors opened to the lobby. We stepped out, shoulders brushing, walking into the chaos of the city not as rivals, but as partners. In every sense of the word. Outside, amidst the rush of traffic, I reached out and adjusted her collar, a gesture of intimacy in the middle of the sidewalk. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it. We had learned that the strongest structures aren't the rigid ones that refuse to bend, but the ones that allow for a little movement. If you've ever found that your biggest rival was actually your perfect match, subscribe for more love stories.